Good day, my fellow Americans and good people of the world. Today I would like to address you in regards to a theme that carries with it the banner of science and the important factors in the philosophy of the spread of knowledge, which is free speech and free thought. Now is the time to discuss this matter because I see it playing out in the larger frame of society, and it keeps repeating itself constantly, and I kind of liken it to an quote excerpt from a TED Talk by Pope Francis. May he rest in peace. The concept is that we need to listen to the cries of our sick and polluted earth. And I think that we are experiencing right now in America a silencing of the voice of Mother Earth. And when you think about it, we have spent quite a lot of time as a human species in our grand evolution and our growth, our development of civilization. We've amassed this large body of knowledge together, and science has helped us to discover the inner workings of the world, the planet that we live in. It has quite literally helped provide our situational context, our historical context, and our find context. It helps us know where we are, when we are, and therefore who we are in the grand scheme of things. And while science is an imperfect system, it's an ever more perfecting system, which, if anything, that theme should truly resonate with America, since, our founding principles is on the ideals of creating an ever more perfect union. And so it's quite disturbing that we have an administration that in the current, present imagery that we're seeing and the current narrative is this sense of the silencing the voice of science and removing it from our sensibilities, and a flat-out denial and rejection of sound science that we have established well and clearly for a very long time. Literally rejecting things like the basic fundamentals of physics because it goes against the misinformation and misdirection and the outright deception that large corporations need to have proliferated throughout our social narrative in order for them to get away with doing things that are not in the best interest of all parties involved. And they have infiltrated our government, and this is nothing new, but it's now that we're in, more modern days and communication is, easy and accessible, anybody can pick up a camera and, point and talk into it and give voice to reason, and then share that with the world. And so it's much harder to control a narrative that not very many people can access the truth. And now anybody can access it, so they have to start using more and more force and more control and more direct, overt, blatant, and obvious exploitation of the relationship between corporations and the government in order to get things to move their way. and are willing to, now more than ever, to just do it and not care how it upsets people, or how people may not be okay with it, or they want to dissent, or they want to at least negotiate the terms and conditions of things. Speak with a voice of reason in debate to say, like, what are your justifications behind this? Because as we see in our body of knowledge, is science through, active research and development, we have realized that these things that corporations do sometimes don't always work out the way that the corporations like to portray that it does. And it becomes harmful to people that live in the neighborhoods around it, despoiling environments, causing a social, discord as well. And so, like, trying to say to these corporations, you don't really have justification for what you're doing, other than you're trying to tell us that economy is what's most important, money is what's most important. And, we had an administration that had some of the richest people in the world who have created corporations that have amassed a tremendous amount of wealth that there is no other truth that can be derived from the reality of things, that other than that they amassed this wealth through nefarious means. And it's not to say that they're bad people, and it's not to say that, their original founding purpose was to be bad. But I liken it very much to like what Google said when they first founded, is like, do no evil, do only, and they removed that from their, defining mission, as they decided they wanted to, dive into the realm of allowing their products and their services to be used by the government in the military. And they found that it was better to silently remove that than to openly admit the fact that they no longer stood by that moral legitimacy, and that they were disregarding that as an integrity-bound situation that they were going to continue to do business on. And it was good for them in the sense that at least they weren't being hypocritical anymore and contradictory. And it gave them, a pass to start just not caring about whether or not they were doing good. And it's not just Google that does this. Every large corporation and every company that stood there and, behind the president, POTUS 47 getting sworn into office, each one of those people represent a different type of company that has chosen to disregard science and to cast a blind eye to the harm that they cause for others, and to try to silence people who want to, inform the world about, their doings and their actions, which are harmful, and that these companies don't take the responsibility for in the outcomes. And again, it's not saying that, all the people that work for these companies are bad, and it's not saying even that the owners, the CEOs are bad. It's just saying that the business itself is tainted and it lacks integrity. And they have aligned themselves and their concept of business with the deviant echelon of society. They deviate from the norms and the standards of good humanity, basic common decency of caring about, what you do and how it impacts others around you. And they justify this by, being, as they like to call it, stewards of, money and, the profits for their shareholders. And it was something that, was brought up recently in regards to the current administration silently removing entire bodies of, dedicated and motivated and brilliant experts in their fields within the EPA to, as the White House describes their justifications for it, or rather the administration describes their justification for it, is to be good stewards of your tax dollars. And if you can't tell, there's an obvious theme that carries through that, and what they care about is money. They care about a bottom line in a relationship to a decimal point, and that relationship to a decimal point has no considerations for the human impact, the planet impact, And it reminds me of another, excerpt quote from the TED Talk by Pope Francis, which was saying, what if while we are, exploring the stars, we care about our neighbors that are orbiting us? What if our technological advancement came with more social inclusion, And it really resonated with me, his talk, mostly because it was like, yeah, right? Why can't we do that? This seems just and fair and reasonable and right. And, the more I consider the realities of the world is that, the people that are decision makers, the people who are in power, are the ones who, hold the platforms and the control and the influence. They're concerned about spinning a particular narrative that reinforces what they need to be true in order for them to be able to work out the advantages of the, schemas that they've created, that they've based their reputations on, they've based their companies on, they've based their incomes on, and their power and these sorts of things. So, they're putting profits at the center instead of people, as Pope Francis said in that TED Talk. And it's really unfortunate. And listening to the current administration dismantle the EPA and try to justify saying we're going to make it do a better job, than what it's been doing, and it's going to be better stewards of taxpayer money by eliminating all these very crucial, important roles, while they stand there and say at the same time they don't believe in climate change. They say that it's a hoax, and not because they have proof or evidence or scientific backing or any sense of explanation as to why the climate is changing, other than to brush it off and use obscure, takes on the situation that doesn't hold up to peer reviews. And to me, it's like they are more interested in silencing the voice of truth than they are admitting the fact that they don't want to align with that truth, because it's much harder for them to make money. It's much harder for, to sustain, adherence to regulations that are put in place to help us to keep our carbon, outputs low enough that we don't raise the temperature too high, that it ends up having a runaway train effect in our planetary boundaries, exceeding them to the point where we're not in the safe operating space anymore. And so, they're denying science, they're rejecting the protections that we have established and developed over time together to say we really need these industries to help, just keep an eye on things, make sure things are operating in such that it's not, potentially hazardous to public health, creating unnecessary, situations where, an overtoxification of one environment has, a domino effect in other areas that may not be quite registered for some time before we see the full impact of it. And that's why we have the science, is so that we can know, we can figure out, but also most important, it's a record sent. It's in annals of time. We're recording what our impact is doing so that we can better understand in the future when our situation will be much different, because it's going to be in the outcome consequences of our past and prior decision making, what we do today and what we've done prior. We're going to have a better understanding of where we are, where we've been, thus we can have a better understanding of where we're going. And so when they take away the voice of science, what they're doing is they're taking away our hopes and our chances of being able to solve for problems that we have not yet caught up to. They lack foresight and forethought. And while they do forecasting, businesses do at least, to see what they can do for generating profits, what they focus on is how they can justify themselves, how they can, create an edge and ride it out and generate profits off of it. Beat out competitors, get more money for themselves, more power for themselves, so they can do more things in the future. I mean, that's what they are doing in this capitalistic free market society that we've created, that is going hand in hand with the state. And I believe the biggest problem that we have right now is this deeply intertwined relationship between corporate America and the United States of America, the actual nation or nation state. And because of the fact that we're no longer operating off of, the intelligence that's necessary to do the right thing, we are operating off of, what do corporations need us to do in order to make the situation easier for them to profit, because we care so much about our revenues, tax revenues, and we care so much about making this a friendly place for businesses. And there's many wonderful, amazing, intelligent, caring nations in the world that are able to generate a substantial amount of GDP, as everybody likes to measure it, while still doing the right thing. And there's no perfect nation, but it's kind of the thing in the sense of there's some trade-offs that we need to make in order to make sure we're making the right decisions, so we're not bankrupting our future. But unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing right now. And the current administration is willing to steal away futures in order to make a few dollars extra here today. And if they were really thinking about it, if they really cared, which they would care if they were able to have a scientific perspective on things, that it would cost less money to ensure we have safe and sound and healthy and secure environments for people to live and raise their children in and work and play and all this. It would make us more money in the long term, because productivity would remain high, because people aren't being taken out because they're sick. And that fact that isn't part of their equation really says something about who they are as individuals, especially when you see some of these, very rich people who have amassed hordes and hordes of wealth and power and influence, are creating technologies to replace people. And not because of the sense of, automation helps us, liberate us so that we can take risks for higher things. No, they're literally thinking, we're doing such a poor job of caring about people and others. There's going to be less and less people in the world, so we need more and more automation, because we have to be able to still remain as productive as we can in order to make money. And I think that is a lot of the underlying tone as to why they are trying to establish cryptocurrencies, which isn't, the, beautiful vast potential of it becoming an instrument of righteousness to help us to level up as a society, as a whole, and, nobody gets left behind sort of thing, but rather, it's a means by which they can shift away from the fact that we're going to have human productivity, and how do you transact off of automation. You would need to have a digital currency in order to, metric that system in order to justify, well, who's amassing, the relationship to the decimal point here today or whatever. And I see it more as, them playing a game of, who can solve the answer of what is to come sort of thing, rather than, trying to consider like the best way to protect the future is to build it sort of thing. So with that, I think we have quite a predicament that we're in right now with large corporations that are being headed by people who fail to regard human decency and human dignity, human life in general. They are self-centered, and they lack the capacity to care enough about others to want to make sure that we're all in this together, nobody gets left behind. And I always hope for the redemption of all people, that they'll wake up into their own personal revelation and see the truth of the evil of their ways. But I don't anticipate that's going to happen anytime soon, from a sense of like morality, like a moral legitimacy. They're not going to like wake up one day and all of a sudden realize, I've been a bad person and I need to change the attitude and direction of my heart. I've been focusing on the wrong things. I've been building out for the wrong things. I think it's going to take, a terrible cataclysmic, awakening to shake the tomb of their souls in order for them to recognize and realize really what they have done is to seal their own fate of a terrible ending. And by that time, it's going to be too late to make a difference, to change their ways, and they're just going to have to live out in that consequence. And in that personal revelation, it's going to be a sad day for them, because their realization is going to be that they had a choice, that they could have stopped at any time, and they chose not to. And, it's one thing to, be ambitious and be a visionary and to see, hey, human progress, I see your potential. There's great things to come, and civilization can't stay the same. We don't want to become, stagnant. We want to progress. It's the natural tendency of evolution. And so it's one thing to want to progress intentionally and to, wake everybody up, like, come on, guys, shift the tides, push for change, and to encourage others to want to be a part of this future. But I always rest back on the how you do anything matters. I too have grand visions of the future that I would like to see unfold. And, my thing about it is that I really care about how I go about doing that. I've taken my time to try to find the right type of people to align with, because it very much matters to me, the attitude and the direction of the heart of the people that I want to entrust with building out this future with me, though I see everybody's going to be involved and everybody's going to have their part, and nobody's going to be left behind. To me, it's very important to make sure that the people who, are a part of that process of development are integrity bound. They have moral legitimacy, and they're willing to do the necessary work of personal development so that the things that we do together are about a restoration of integrities, and that never becomes something that is corrupted by the corruptibilities of the human heart and the human mind. And I know very much it's a matter of if you put a person in a different environment, give them different, visions, then they will change their ways. I believe in redemption as that possibility. But I think the problem is that there's lots of people who have made companies and they are so focused on making money that they're willing to sacrifice things that actually matter, what's important, and replace it with relationships to a decimal point. Money is what matters. And in that, they're willing to, turn a blind eye when people are hurt or harmed, or they're willing to, advance false narratives, because those false narratives are the better storyline for people to follow in terms of agreeing that their business is still something that is worth doing. I really think that America shouldn't be considering allowing these types of businesses to proliferate if they're not able to do so in such a way that is aligned with the concept of stewardship, well-faring stewardship, which is about making sure that the world works for 100% of the people without the disadvantage of anyone, so that nobody gets left behind and that everybody gets to live the good life, and to do so without ecological offense. And so I'm quite offended that the POTUS 47's administration decided to just gut the EPA and has, cleansed the board of any evidence of climate science that has given us that knowledge necessary to do the right thing, and that corporations are essentially paying the power players in positions of government to do their bidding of setting things up so they don't have regulations and they don't have rules and they don't have oversight. And the worst part about it is there is absolutely no corrective mechanism. So as Americans are harmed by business practices, there will be no path of recourse. There will be no regulatory system. There will be no, oversight committee. And the systems in place that could have been corrective in our judicial system have essentially been neutered to be able to do anything about it. So things like a company pours its toxic paint chemicals into waterways, and that water then flows downstream to an area where your children play, and they swim in this water that isn't obviously toxified and polluted, but they're swimming around it, and there's a chemical in there that causes harm to your child, and then your child becomes sick. And to me, it's like, if there was a regulator there, they would have been checking to make sure that this company wasn't polluting. And if they were found polluting, they would be stopped, which, I think even at the job they were doing before everything was gutted wasn't even sufficient enough. So now it's going to be even worse. And then the corrective mechanisms for a company to be held liable and accountable for this are extremely limited, because the federal government is on the side of protecting corporations and their moneyed interests over protecting human health and well-being. And so my biggest problem with this, of course, is like, I don't want people to get sick, and I don't want environments to be polluted, you know. I don't want our air to be so toxified that we can't breathe. I mean, already as it is, we are experiencing a tremendous amount of health problems because of our polluted air throughout America. Our waterway systems are polluted, you know, infrastructures are polluted, and instead of there being a regulatory system that holds, you know, states accountable to upgrading their systems to keep their people safe, instead they get away with it, and then people become sick, and then the people have to live in this state of illness, and they become unwell, and their lifespans are shortened, and their quality of life is hindered. And you know, I'm thinking just even of Flint, Michigan is probably one of the, you know, most blatant examples of corruption of a government, you know, cutting corners to save money, and where they didn't care about whether or not they were saving lives. And then, you know, the fact that we are a very carbon intensive nation, and we are one of the largest polluters in that regard. We are, from a distance, effectively, I don't know how to see it any other way, but like murdering people in other nations for our lack of care to adhere to just simple, basic terms and conditions and parameters of what is reasonable, comfortable conservation, in order to make sure that we stay within reasonable limits and bounds, so that we aren't causing undue and unnecessary harm and struggle and suffering to our fellow humans in other places, or even in America. Climate change is coming home all of the time, you know, and people just pass it off as like, oh, it's just another weather event, you know, or it's just another, you know, natural disaster. It's like the intensity and the frequency and the, you know, aftermath damage from these are becoming worse and worse. And then please note that there's nothing in the books of the plans of the current administration to help our states to get together so that we can build back more resilient, so that we make sure that we are upgrading our systems, knowing that, you know, things are not going to be getting better anytime soon. They, in fact, are going to be worse. And so it's really weird to me that, you know, they're so concerned about money, but they're not concerned about the fact that you're going to lose productivity, which means you're going to lose money. There's eventually going to be a point in time, it's an unavoidable thing, where the rich are going to have to be taxed. And it's going to be at an extremely high rate in the future. And I don't care if it's even a conservative president, you know, they are still going to realize, listen, guys, tough decision. We got to do this because we have no other options. And it's going to be a really difficult place for us to put any politician in. It's going to be a really difficult place to put any, you know, anybody in terms of decision making, because you have to make the hard decisions in terms of, you know, how do we continue on when our capacity for continuation is being limited? And I foresee that the many people who are the richest among us are essentially just using us here in America for our, good graces and, our favorable conditions. And, but eventually, the wealth and abundance that makes this place so alluring is going to be depleted as this place becomes less and less of a safe haven to live in. And then they're going to go somewhere else. So, catering to people who have money, catering to the needs of the people who have money is just, it's kind of dumb, because as soon as we don't have what they want, they're going to just leave. And then we'll be left with this whole entire system that was rigged into their favor and no capacity to shift it, so easily into a situation that will help everybody else that's going to be stuck here. And I think we really need to wake up to that reality. And I think that kind of is a justification as to why, if we start making changes and some of those people leave, that's going to be quite all right. They have to operate off of what they think is their best interest. But I think what would be most compelling to get them to stay is not to help to rig systems in their favor so that they can extract and profit and have no consequences when they do bad things and harm others, but rather to achieve one simple basic truth, which is to keep America a place worth defending, and to make sure that this is such a place that helps people to be safe and sound. It's one of the bigger accomplishments that we have made over time here in the United States. We've developed, this massive army, right? This massive military base, and all of these armaments and whatnot. And that sense of having military might really makes us a very appealing place to go to. And we have the standing of, immigrants want to come here because they sense this is a place where you can be free from tyranny and harm and things. Obviously not right now during the current administration, but it has been a long-standing ideal until recent years, with the first administration, President, POTUS 45, and now POTUS 47, together, making up, these two separate terms. The development of our immigration system in that time period has really made America a very terrifying and frightening place, not just for immigrants that are on their way here, but immigrants that are already here, and then people who are naturalized citizens. It's why do you want to, live in a place where, it's not like you walk around with a badge on you that clearly distinguishes whether or not you're a citizen or not, which therefore makes you very easy to be discriminated against if you don't have that. But people who are Latino or Black or look like they come from, somewhere that isn't, white European descent, you get discriminated against. And now doesn't matter if you're a citizen or not. You look like you're not white, so you look like you don't belong, or you may be not speaking English, and they're trying to say that English is our official language here, when we speak so many languages in America. It's ridiculous to think that if you don't speak English, then you can't live here. That's out of the question. Ridiculous. But citizens who are of the mind that they are privileged in being able to talk down to people that they don't consider look like what America should look like, like white nationalism. They will attack individuals for speaking Spanish, I hear it often. It's like a terrible attack that I hear people do to others is like, speak American when somebody's speaking Spanish. And they're not even talking to the person. They're like talking to their friend and they happen to be speaking in Spanish. And they're like, speak American. I was like, what are you talking about? Speak American, English is a very common language, but it's not the most common language. And yes, it's nice to know, and it's good for us to be able to communicate with each other in that common, language with one another. But it's wrong to say that somebody can't speak a different language just because they're in America, and for them to be isolated and singled out because of that. This comes back to the whole idea of like free speech and free thought. Like, I don't understand why there is such an attack on free speech right now. And that there's such an attack on this concept of like, if you don't look a certain way or talk a certain way or act a certain way, you are all of a sudden this, thing to be attacked and to be silenced and to be removed. Because, the First Amendment to the Constitution tells us, that we have freedom of speech and freedom of press. And these are two really big factors to the concept that underlies our entire nation. But we're having the current administration attacking the press, suing them into oblivion, causing, companies to essentially pay the president a bribe to get him to not use his power of office against them or prevent them from doing business as usual, because they crossed him in some way by casting him in an unfavorable light, said something that irked him or got under his skin because he's thin-skinned and he's got a very, very fragile ego. And he's using the might and the force of the courts and the threats of tariffs strategically done, backroom deals, because they know it's going to cut off the lifelines of certain companies, and they want to attack those individuals in those companies to get them to bend to their will. Like, that's a form of silencing dissent as well. And the whole point of the freedom of press is the freedom to press powers that be and speak truth to that power. And the fact that we're losing our capacity to speak truth to power, not because we don't want to, but because there's some entity there that is threatening to encroach upon us and take this away from us, because we stand in the way of them being able to tell the narrative that they need to have prevail. And so when you have any, person in a position of power or influence or government doing things to silence individuals, this is a strong indicator of lack of integrity. It's a very, very strong indicator of lack of moral legitimacy. It's a very strong indicator of a very weak and fragile ego. And it's also a very strong indicator of someone that is unreasonable. And the problem is that, well, of course, everybody wants to protect the thing that they base their reputation on, and protect the thing that they, base their livelihoods on. The fact of the matter is that if what you base your reputation on is a lie, then you should be called out for that, and you should be answerable to it. And the approach shouldn't be to try to silence individuals who want to speak the truth, to say this isn't just, this isn't fair, this isn't right, or bully people into being silenced, complying, or to causing, shame and harm to individuals to get them to bend to your will, because you need them to be silent, because you need the world to think that you are a certain way, you act a certain way, you do certain things, And to me, it's extremely unreasonable that we have a POTUS who is forcibly in a way silencing and stealing the voice of the people. I don't think that anybody should ever be in a position where someone uses their power to silence another person. I think that probably a reason why this is a thing that a lot of people, feel is we're in an evolving situation of civilization and our adaptation of the technological advancements of communication. Evolution, in my opinion, evolution means communication. We're in a big pivoting point and turn in our evolution in terms of communication, and so there's a lot of the old world leaving and the new world trying to replace it, trying to break through to the other side, and then the people that are trying to hold on to their positions in between, and there's a lot of conflict because there's a lot of people that are like, there's value in this traditional system. And then there's people that are like, but yeah, once this new system's gonna be so much better. Trust us, just trust us. And then there's people in between being like, I don't know what to trust or believe in because this all seems just too much, and it's too confusing and you can't understand it. And I liken it to the pushback that happened during the Industrial Revolution. There was many the laborers, farm workers and stuff, didn't want to lose their jobs, and crafters didn't want to lose their jobs by automated systems coming in, and so they fought against it because it's that's my livelihood, that's who I am as a person, that's how I identify. And then these automated systems came in and took over those jobs, and those people were then put in a difficult situation because the unfortunate thing was that there were not supports to help them through the transition, and so a lot of people were left in terrible destitution because of it. Again, with our technological advancement should come social inclusion, but that just didn't happen, and I think that we're experiencing that now as well. And we're seeing, the advancement of new forms of communication in terms of doing videos like this and leaving them as a record sent, a time capsule in time, for anybody to, whoever tunes in, whoever tunes out. Podcast conversations. In some of the older traditional news networks are finding themselves to have less and less of an audience because it's not quite as appealing because of how they package things is not really satiating the appetites of the current trends in communication. It's the same concept of newspapers and hard magazines and things like that being replaced by digital archives. And then we have this difficult situation of our newspapers are so important. It is a lifeline of information for our understanding of the world that we belong to and we fit into. And so the fact that they're losing funding, the government is cutting funding for the public broadcasting system and for NPR. These are lifelines of intelligence and knowledge. And, to me, it's silencing the voice of the people by doing that. And it is intentionally, directly manipulating people into forcing them to become ignorant. And then trying to just distract them with this, content that comes from different locations that doesn't necessarily give people anything that is like based in reality and based off of, facts and figures. And it makes everybody docile and complicit in like resting in complacency and very easily distracted. And I don't know why we have a government that's willing to shut down this sense of like we should have just this, voice that is able to be disseminated to everybody, that is telling the whole truth of who we are as a nation in the most genuine and authentic and realistic way, that isn't, entertainment, propaganda that's being shoved down your throat. And I believe that integrity-bound companies like PBS and NPR are really about preserving that voice of reason. And so it's silencing truth and hiding it. And then, silencing the truth of science and hiding it. And then feeding people just flat out propaganda. When you look at everything that has come out of the White House, is propaganda. It's like a performative TV show. And so they need the narrative to match that, so people are convinced that's reality instead of being able to see the cracks in, the things that they're claiming, because it doesn't align with the lived experience of people. And when they cut off being able to hear the voices of, everybody, and then they only amplify the voices of a few, you're not hearing what's happening, the everyday kitchen table concerns of people in other places in America. And the government is telling you what to do, what to think, what to feel, and convincing you everything's fine. And because of that, you are becoming desensitized to the fact that there is genuine human suffering. And so the people who are able to, not lose themselves in, the propaganda, who go out on the streets and, protest it and things like that, that's a new form of communication that's rising. We're realizing how truly important face-to-face conversations, over a cup of coffee, these are important. These are things that we've lost because our technology took us into a screen and took us away from being there present with one another and remembering, that real human authentic connection and relationship that we have. And because of that detachment, and which is even more so like when you're losing, local radio stations and local news networks because of funding getting taken away. And you're losing newspapers because funding streams dry up because people have lost the sense of its value. You are getting left with, entertainment that is passed off as if it's news, like Fox. And the problem with that, of course, is that you're not really getting informed about anything. You're getting, shown something. It's like watching a TV drama. It's literally like a soap opera, and you're not getting information. You're not getting what you need to know in order to make informed decisions. And when the people who do know what's going on have no platform of, to be able to go onto to voice what's being said, there's nothing to counter the narrative of the negative or the narrative of the deceptions. And so people are operating off of misinformation. And a lot of the information that they're getting is mixed in with a little bit of a, oh yeah, that's what's going on, but then it's filled in with a bunch of bullshit. Excuse the language. But it does take you into a certain way of capturing the narrative and taking it in a direction that isn't necessarily where it needs to go in order to reveal the truth of the situation, And so people aren't being able to be informed to know what to do. It's just like the concept of it would not be possible for us to go back to the moon right now if we reject and deny science and we cut off funding for science. We're going to find a lot of people who are brilliant scientists are going to leave America because it's no longer a safe space for them. It's no longer welcoming. It's not a welcome situation that they can thrive on. It's a place that's increasingly becoming more threatening to, their sensibilities. They're like, we're truth seekers and we want to be able to speak the truth to power because that's what we need to do in order to make sure that we're being led in the right direction and not being deceived. And because of the fact that they're not allowed to do that, and because, news reporters are being harassed and hounded and threatened and blackmailed and, extorted and, forced into briberies to stay alive and whole entire, voices that resonate truth to people are being canceled and removed from, the lineups of, people to be able to have something to tune into that helps them to make sense of this world, because of that, we're becoming a less and less free place. And I think that having this sense of having your voice taken from you is a really difficult thing to process in a time period when, communication is advancing so much and the reality of we're getting left behind as a collective, as a society, because not everybody is able to have a voice, and again, I think that this experience that we're having right now, the extreme, is a result from, lots of people for many years were feeling that their voices were being suppressed. Conservatives thought that, they were being, silenced on social medias. They figured that their voice wasn't getting heard, that they were being, silenced somehow. And so they just raged hard in retaliation for it. And now, they are trying to be the loudest and trying to capture every conversation, trying to make it all about them. And in the meantime, mocking and laughing at who they blame for their, woes of silence before, and saying, haha, how does it feel? And it's just this like extreme, consequence. And I think that, I remember I used to be really into listening to podcasts because I liked listening to the voice of the people and people feeling I have a voice and I can speak my truth and not have to worry about, being edited by some company that had to worry about a particular type of narrative that they were holding up, and that was a lot of the, things about mainstream media that people didn't like, even though curating, newsworthy voice to make sure it's integrity bound is a thing of value, but podcasts kind of gave people a way to freewheel and say whatever they thought, and but I used to listen to podcasts, and I remember having these insights and people who were a part of groups who felt that they were being silenced, like a lot of academics especially. They were worried about what they would say and worried that they would end up losing tenure or, get fired or replaced, or, reprimanded or disciplined or, publicly castrated and cancel culture. And there was a lot of sensitivity that was built up during that time to the point where that set the framework for people to go into this major extreme where, it's like a war of words. It's crazy. And not to laugh to make it seem funny, but it's just some people say it's we're fighting for the soul of America, and it's really all we're doing is fighting over who gets to determine how the story's gonna go. And to me, it's I think we should be, listening to the storytellers that are telling us a story that's good, telling us a story about, positivity and love and unity and peace and togetherness and, solutions to our problems and, the realities of our situation and calling people out on their bullshit and, uncovering these hidden truths and, exposing toxic lies and these sorts of things. We should have those types of conversations. But, listening to these people that were complaining about cancel culture, they just got so enraged because they felt they were being silenced. And trust me, I can totally relate. I respect that. It's a terrible place to be. But I think that the situation is to, want to be able to speak your mind and say these people are doing bad things that they never should have done. And the fact that they continuously do it and then there's no path of recourse is exactly why we should all be from every side of the aisle, be very upset about what's happening right now in the current administration for president. POTUS 47 is setting the groundwork to point, click, and silence anybody he wants. Cancel anybody he wants. It's no longer a cultural, socio-cultural, and civic ideal where, these things are being played out in culture. It's now instead being played out in the Oval Office at the whim of a man who has a very fragile ego and will create a knee-jerk reaction to anybody saying something that, doesn't appeal to his sensibilities of thinking that he is the center of the universe, So I have a big problem with that and the fact that some people are waking up to it, but not all people are waking up to it, especially on the conservative side. I think they're still in denial of the fact that, they think that, well, it's not our voices that are being silenced. It's finally those liberals are learning to shut up, because we have the power to silence them or take away the, mainstream from them, and we have the voice and we're going to be heard, these sorts of things. And to me, like, we have to realize this is the wrong direction for us to go. Either we should not be in any one extreme. I don't think there should be any one, ideological side that gets to determine whether or not somebody gets to speak their mind. I think that, it's a fundamental governing principle for me, is like, I don't care about the political left and I don't care about the political right. I don't care about the Democratic Party. I don't care about the Republican Party. I care about the responsible party. To me, we should be finding that common sense through line that just, helps us to govern based off of the basics, the things that are relative to us all, It's like having two circles, and here's all the people that are in the right, and here's everybody that's in the left. Somewhere in between there we have overlaps, and that's our basis of humanity. That's our common ground. And if we govern from that area, then nothing that we do in policy wise is going to be too extreme against, pitting against one side or another, and everybody has a chance to assume their capacities and their abilities to influence outcomes and, work out solutions and things like that, in the ways that they see fit. But it's no one, side getting to determine, let's go this extreme, because it doesn't matter which concept it is, whether it's free speech or if it's, the truth of science. Taking from one extreme is going to create a, equal and opposite impact, So, when we think about that, there has to be this like sense of moderation and this sense of finding the mean, the through line by which we can all relate to, that's reasonable enough. And then I think that will help us calm down the extremes and bring more people closer into the center. While there still be some like total fringe, outliers, at least their capacity to harm the greater good is diminished, because less and less people are going to be about, knee-jerk reaction in extremes, because there is this sensible, feasible, moderate influence. And so I think that having the right type of approach to government, in the terms of making sure that all voices are heard and considered, and that nobody feels silenced or oppressed, but also that nobody feels like anybody can come out and tell the world who you are without you getting to have a say in it as well. I think that that's a lot of where I see, and I can, empathize with where Trump's coming from, and, recent reports coming out with details of some breaking story that cast him in a very unfavorable light, at an opportune moment when he's very weak and exposed in regard to his missteps in his handling of the very difficult and sensitive situation of the case around the Jeffrey Epstein. And for that fact that it's a really sensitive situation, because Trump did have a relationship with Epstein, the extent to which that relationship, went into, and how they were aligned and how they were involved, and whether or not Trump had anything to do with the nefarious, the bad acting and nefarious intent to which, Epstein was being held to account for. That's not the point. The point is that the American people don't know what that relationship is. They don't know what that connection is, and they want to know. And for good reason. I don't think it's just because we need to know, who it is that we elected, because I think we all have a pretty good, clear indication of who he is as a person. What we don't really know is what he is willing to do in order to protect his reputation, or the things that he bases his reputation on. And what we're seeing is him give a little tiny bit of leeway for releasing the information, but at the same time really protecting it. This sense that's there from the way that he's behaving is that he's trying to hide something and isn't willing for people to know the truth. And he's lashing back this is like a defamation, and this is attack by the media, and, this is a personal attack to try to defame me or something, and, to attack my credibilities and things like that. And it's but if that was the case, don't you think that you would want to be able to stand your ground and defend yourself? Which one way you could do that is by, taking people to court to defend yourself, against this defamation. But that's not what he's doing. He's taking people to court to bully them into silence, into compliance with his force of the narrative. He is literally weaponizing the justice system. This is what he's done as a man of money his whole life. This is what people, the deviant echelon, naturally do. They use, weaponization of the justice system. They use their money, they use their platforms, they use their power and their influence in order to silence people who they see as a potential risk or threat against their constructed realities. And so I think that the reasonable thing to do, an honorable man would just say, hey, this is what other people are saying, but I'm going to come forward with my honest truth of, this is how I saw things from my position. This is where I'm coming from on the matter, and I hope people will give me a chance to, prove myself to be, authentic and true to my word when I say I am a person that is trustworthy. But people aren't necessarily giving Trump that opportunity. It's a difficult situation he's in because he's president, yes, but also a difficult situation because he's put himself in a corner in this situation. He used his entire campaign platitudes, going and talking to anybody that would give him platform and listen to him and allow him safe space to just ramble off and say whatever and not be held to account on anything, whether, calling him out on any of his bullshit. But he promised people that this is the thing that he would take care of. Yeah, I have no problem with this. But now that it is, called out for it, suddenly he has a problem with it. And now it's making people suspicious. Well, why? And I don't think it's just Trump, covering for himself. I think that he's trying to protect other interests that have brought it to his attention. And it's kind of like that mutually assured destruction sort of thing. Is like, if you tell on me, I'll tell on you, and then we're all screwed. So everybody has to be silenced. This is what happens when you have many people in positions of power who've done a wrong thing. They have to stick together to protect their own asses. And in this case, in order for them to protect themselves from facing the consequences of their wrongdoing, they would have to admit that they did wrong, And I don't think they have the capacity to admit that. And they certainly don't have the capacity to apologize for that. And they certainly don't have the capacity to fix the mistakes that they made. Because everything's on the line, and it's like, now what do we do? And the problem is that makes us more and more, as a society, desensitized to violence against innocence. Is more important to protect the powerful interests of a few than it is to preserve and protect the innocence of the many. Because while, there is a limited number, a very large, insanely large and disgusting, when you quantify it, number of victims from the whole Jeffrey Epstein sex trafficking bullshit, those are just the ones that you know about, and that we have an inclination about. Those have been able to come forward. And his ring of doing that isn't the only one of its kind in the world. There's many others that are doing that. And the Trump administration has cut off funding to programs to help to stop human trafficking. So you can say with all certainty it's not in his interest or his care or his concern to protect innocence from those sorts of things happening. He's more concerned about using his money, power, and influence, that he's probably getting money from all kinds of sources that are willing to throw it in there to help to protect, to save their asses. And they're willing to attack and bully and extort and blackmail and whatever other means and mechanisms they have at their disposal to try to conform these people and control these people to prevent them from revealing the truth. And the problem with that is that what they're doing is preventing all of those victims from being made whole. They're preventing for that case to be revealed and for us to know what really happened, so that we can take the steps within that basis of knowledge to prevent these things from happening in the future, protect innocence from these sorts of terrible exploitations in the future. And to me, it's, it goes back to some of the most terrifying and heart-wrenching stories that I read within the book, The Locust Effect, which is very eye-opening and revealing, and it was a difficult book to read. It had a lot of trauma triggers that came up from it, but also realizing, there's a lot of bad actors with nefarious intent in the world. And people in positions of power may not have necessarily been bad people, but when they were put in a position of power, they recognized how easy it is to do the wrong thing because there isn't consequences to it. There's nobody to hold you to account. You have the equivalent of fuck you money, and so, anybody that tries to stop you from harming them, you can easily just turn your, devices against them, And there are many cases where people, even those who are supposed to serve and protect, that were doing harm to individuals. And so to me, it's like, that whole case isn't just about, what Trump's involvement was. It's not just like, we need to, understand who all was involved with it. And that we need to have some sort of accountability because this was actually a thing that happened. But it's also about, we need to do what it's going to take to make those victims whole. And we need to do what it's going to take in order to make the perpetrators whole by helping them come into the realization that what they did was wrong. It was a mistake. And to put in a corrective mechanism so that they can fix it and rectify it. They need to pay a recompense. They need to reconcile, and they need to redeem, and they need to definitely reform, and they need to find a way to reintegrate back into society. And so I think that being a really big situation in our current administration exemplifying his need to control the narrative and willingness to silence people out of protecting and saving his own ass, and then, his cohort, whoever is in on it too. Because I can't imagine that he doesn't have related friends other than just Epstein, because he was friends with Epstein, and then the fact that he is right now breaking down the systems that are voices of reason and logic and truth and reality and speaking truth to power and, informing the public, educating people on the situations and the circumstances to which we find ourselves in. The fact that he's breaking down systems, he's silencing critics, he's threatening, and he is weaponizing the justice system. He is sicking every single one of his dogs on anybody who dares to question him. And the fact that he is federalizing the National Guard and using it against the American people who are dissenting, because he needs them to not be out of align with his interests, despite the fact that what he's doing, less and less people are okay with it as they watch how he's actually doing it, how he is executing on these, campaign promises. Most people are like, I didn't sign up for this. You didn't tell me that this is what you're gonna do. You said you were going to go after bad guys and criminals with the immigration system, not throwing, a bunch of people that have been, racially profiled, ripping them off the streets, or and throwing them into, bunker cages and, grandstanding about it and showing it off and laughing about it and selling merchandise about it, making fun of human indignification and suffering that they are inflicting and imposing on. We are literally right now living the whole painfotainment thing, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, Painfotainment. Watch that episode, or listen to it, whatever. Really harsh reality, but we're living in that to an extreme right now. These are like, the gladiator fighting, and it's like they're perfectly fine with throwing these people to the wolves because it's good show, sell popcorn and let people go through. I'm waiting for, once Trump gets to the point where he can threaten enough people who are trying to stand up against this, stand up for what's right, once he's able to stop them enough from coming after him, disempowering them, neutering their capacities to, do checks and balance on him, I wouldn't imagine it would be far off for him to do some sort of gladiator fighting sort of thing. Just because everything he does is a negative spectacle of negative outcome consequences. That is everything he is, that's everything he does, that's what he's all about. And I'm not laughing because it's funny, but I'm laughing because it's just like, of course our world is that absurd right now. Given everything that's happened, makes perfect sense why things happened, the way they did. And, even though it looks really rough, it all makes sense now. But, there are redeeming qualities in every person, in every situation. And, it's not all is lost sort of thing. And I don't think that people should fall into a sense of woeism and doubt and fear and these sorts of things, because one thing holds true in any and all quarters of the universe: fear does not stop death, it stops life. And so it's really important to continuously face that fear and call it out for what it is. Reminds me of, the idea of, I used to be fond of the Harry Potter books. I used to read them to my children growing up. Fell out of complete favor with that entire, book line, because I don't agree with the author's personal approach, how they choose to show up in the world in such a indignified way. But I do have some morals to the story that do come through every once in a while that I can relate to, because a lot of people did endear to those stories, before they were left with the moral dilemma of, how can you appreciate something like that when the author seems very contradicting to the entire notions of, what they claim to stand for. But one of the particular aspects of these books is in a sense of seeing the entities that would come and try to suck your soul out, essentially, and that the best way to attack them is to have a brighter spirit within yourself come out, or turning another form of creature that comes out that plays on your greatest fear, and that the only way to resolve it is to make it ridiculous. I think that those are the notions. Again, it's the same concept of mythologies and metaphors and things like that. They help us to make sense of the world in a way that's, tapping into our subconscious and abstract thinking, which, helps us to make sense of the world and problem solve and these sorts of things. Because it's kind of like a thing that you can see, but not if you're directly looking at it. But that notion of if we call out the fearful things that we're seeing right now, I really think that that's going to be the most powerful tool that we have. Call out the ridiculousness of the situation, a lot of what I'm seeing from, some of the comedic, people, which, unfortunately, Colbert's not going to be with us for very much longer. But some of the other comedic platforms that are trying to bring, light to the situation that we're in, I think they're doing the right thing, because they're, helping us to realize how ridiculous things are. But I think there's limits to everything, because it's also a matter of, you don't want to flare the egos of already very sensitive people who have very sensitive egos. It's something that I very much learned, not too long ago. I lived in a situation where I didn't really have a need for an ego defense, because I was just perfectly content and happy with being my authentic self and showing up every day. I didn't have to protect myself from other people. And then that changed. And when that changed, my orientation with the world changed. And so I'm empathetic to others who, when they're put in a position of the world questioning you, maybe you need to be on the defensive. But I think we shouldn't be going so far as trying to attack the ego so it flares up, which just turns into another legit cycle of conflict. I think that the appropriate approach is to call out the ridiculousness of it. It's you're being silly, and you're being foolish. sort of thing. But in such a way that is like inviting you to be like, this is a learning opportunity, you know? I think the other aspect of all of this that would really be, you know, positive is to take things not so seriously. I understand like why we take things, oh yeah, I know why we take things seriously, because it's personally hurtful when you realize that people are mocking you, or they're making fun of you, or, you know, they are, you know, laughing about you behind your back or joking about you, these sorts of things. Or they're trying to make you out to be something that you're not. Or they're exploiting you and taking your sense of who you are and then smearing your entire identity and your credibility. I get that's a difficult thing, you know. It is very easy to take that seriously because, you know, first of all, who the fuck are these people to think that they could come in and just ruin your entire life, you know, based off of their capacity to do it, you know? Especially like when it happens to innocent people who are, you know, have no ill will towards anyone, no intent for harm, but are, you know, very much about, you know, one of the soul current values that I hold is that, you know, if our unity requires my silence about injustice, then the cost is too much. The cost is way too high. So I will always call out injustice, but, and I think that we all should do that. But we shouldn't have to worry about doing that, you know, triggering an ego defense in people who are then in positions of power that use it against you because they need you to shut the fuck up, excuse my language, in order for them to protect what they base their reputation on. You know, you're a risk to them, you're a threat, you know, and so they need to subdue you and silence you and harm you in order to protect themselves. And then this whole concept is like you're taking away the innocence of somebody who, you know, had no conflict in their heart and their mind. You know, their intentions was to be a constructive criticism. Like, calling out this is not something that should have ever happened. And it did. And I think everybody should know about it because this is an opportunity for that person to be able to face their truth and make corrections, you know, humble themselves of the ignorance that they had and do the personal development to improve from there, you know? And I think that if we had a society that was more receptive to that sense of like we're all just human and we all make mistakes and we should all be, you know, loving and forgiving for each other to give opportunities for those mistakes to be fixed, we would have a much healthier, happier, safer, less conflict inducing social paradigm, you know. But I think that, you know, having that personal experience myself, I can very much sympathize with those who are currently being attacked by Trump, who's using his platform, his money, his power, his influence, his friends, those who have allegiance to him, to attack people who they feel is, you know, going to potentially prevent them from, you know, achieving their outcomes. And so having that sympathy for people, you know, but then also I understand why the ego flares up that way. You know, I care enough about understanding human psychology and, you know, the philosophy of, you know, human relationships to get why people respond the way they do. And I'm not immune to it either. I do as well. I have made many mistakes in my life in terms of misplacing trust in people, for, hoping that somebody would see my weaknesses and vulnerabilities and choose not to exploit them because of my hope in my heart for them to be the good humanity and potential that I saw in them, and that they would choose good humanity over their ego defense. So I know and I understand that, and I've been there before too. But I think that we lack this moral education in our society that teaches people, like, again, we should never be silent about things that are unjust. And we should be able to give voice to reason, especially in the case of, like, when you take away the voice of the people and then you don't give them a chance to explain to why they had to leave. Now everybody who depended on that voice to be there, it was a voice of reason, it was a trusted voice that was well established and well implemented, it was a one true solid constant of reasonableness, and for that to just be immediately taken away, everybody who relied and depended on that now no longer have that vital source of information and insight and truth in the world. And so you're shrinking the capacity for others to orient in the world with truth and reliability. And the problem is we need as many honest voices in the world as is possible. We need people that are willing to be integrity bound, that are willing to self-develop to make sure that they fix mistakes when they make them, that are willing to say, I am sorry, but are also, have a spine and are willing to say, I'm not okay with, not calling out injustice. And the fact that we don't have enough integrity bound people in the world is really our biggest problem right now in the sociological paradigm. And I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out, like, how do we solve for this, I've tried over the years various different ways to, voice my opinion on the facts of, like, if we can mutually agree to kind of orient ourselves towards, establishing a common truth amongst everybody, it's probably the best approach for us to be able to get along with one another. But it's hard to get people to want to align and orient with that because it's not the popular path, and it's not the, political path, and, it's not a path of popularity, that's for sure. It's kind of like the quote by MLK, where it's like, sometimes we have to take a position just because it's right. And, that ends up putting you in a position where a lot of your peers are not going to be okay with you because you no longer are able to reconfirm their sensibilities to them. I relate it to, I used to be on Twitter, and I was essentially bullied off of that platform by, other people that decided to violate my digital presence and my personhood. And leaving that space was really hard for me because I did connect, with truthful, lights of truth in these people, and formed relationships with them. And then I was a light of truth for them too, and they lost me when I left. But being in that space, it was many people that I formed relationships with that didn't always see the same as me. You know, we would get in a conversation about something and we weren't on the same page about stuff when we started, and it would be about this hot button topic of the day or whatever, but the way that we were able to come at it in an approach where I respected, you know, I didn't try to kill their spirit, you know. I wanted them to bring their spirit, you know, their authenticity, bring it to the table. Let's talk about this. You know, ideas are what we're, you know, talking about here and arguing about and, you know, disagreeing about. It's not you as a person. And so I made so many friendships with people that were from way on the other side of aisles on ideals with me. And we would get into back and forth conversations about stuff. It's like that kind of sensibility, I think, is what I enjoyed most about fostering connections with people in that space, is because the people that I was able to meet there were not all of one mind, not of all of one opinion. They were varied, and they were, you know, interested in just discovering the best truth that we know and in sharing that. Those were the type of people that I connected with best in those spaces. I also did encounter quite a bit of people that were needing to base their entire existence on a conformity to a certain ideal. And while I was in agreement with some of the things that they believed in, I couldn't wholly conform to it in this like weird cult-like fandom sort of way. I don't really have that tendency in me. Like, I champion for people. Absolutely. I champion for the best in everybody, the potential I see in them. I will champion for everybody, and sometimes to an extreme where people are like, whoa, like, I didn't know you appreciated me that much. But I'm not a fandom type person. I've never been able to be that way. But when I related with people who would take things to the extremes of their loyalty based off of the fact that they are willing to deny and reject reality, they're willing to twist, fact, attack, and distort reality, they're willing to, you know, be puppets advancing the narratives of people that are not necessarily based in truth. And, you know, whether or not those people know it's the truth, I don't know. I don't think they care. In a lot of the cases, they just want to be another one of the voices that are a part of that orchestra of, or chorus of, you know, choir or whatever, of people that are all singing the same chorus. Like, but where that comes dangerous, it's like this cult mentality, and I don't align with that kind of stuff, you know. And I know that that's the main reason. I tried quite a few times to go back to Twitter, even after getting, you know, exiled from it, essentially, mostly just to see, like, you know, could I reintegrate back into those spaces. And then I come to find out, of course, I can't, because I feel the same type of, you know, exploitation of my personhood in those spaces. They just, it doesn't feel right. But going back and trying to like reconnect with some of the people that I knew, and then try to observe the changes in the platform, especially as it went from Twitter to, you know, being evolved into X or whatever it is now. Finding the tone and the vibe and the like way things are, you know, it feels like an experience that's done to you instead of an experience that is, you know, opened for you, and like an opportunity to experience this wonderful, brilliant technology of communication with, you know, togetherness. And, you know, it really resonated with me because that's kind of like how I see government, is like a pathological togetherness. And I want to understand how we create, our sociological connections with people. So I really appreciated social media because of that. And, I have not been back to the platform formerly known as Twitter in quite some time, but the last time I was there, it was kind of like very, factioned and cliquey, and you only had certain voices that were advanced, and very much like a rage machine, and a lot of inappropriateness being projected, and very few voices of reason, and even good people, good voices were turned into, put on defense, and so it brought out the worst in them. Like, it literally is a platform that brings out the worst in humanity, which is sad because it wasn't that to begin with. That's not the original spirit of intent of the founding of that platform. And but what I'm getting at with that is the fact that we have so many people that like think that the platform formerly known as Twitter is like the only source of content and information. It certainly is not a public town square where everybody can come and talk. You can't. It's essentially a place where you can go sit down and shut the fuck up and listen to these few people tell you what to do, what to think, what to feel. And if they don't, you're there for their entertainment, for them to fuck with you, and it's like, that is not appealing at all, and for the few people that it is appealing to, it's like there's something wrong with those people, and I wonder how they relate to others in the real world, because I can imagine that they must have great difficulty of making genuine, authentic human connections. And I originally thought that that was what social media was supposed to be about, was to help us to be able to create more genuine, authentic human connections. And I see it more and more devolving, especially with AI being added into it. It's like totally, distorting the entire experience, and making it all so fabricated, and it took away all of the fun, And the only good thing about that I see, silver lining, because I see silver linings in everything, is that as people become, more repulsed by that entire, this is not healthy for any human to experience, they'll go back into the real world and experience people in face-to-face encounters, sit down and have a conversation over a cup of coffee, because that's what you care about, is that face-to-face, human-to-human, one-on-one connection, instead of, hiding behind a screen and typing at people, trying to enrage a person or to own the libs or whatever everybody's all about now. I do believe, this goes back into something I think that is really important to implement, especially after POTUS 47 leaves office and we have a new president come in. I really believe that we need to establish a social media platform that connects as a true public town square for all the people in America to be able to come and interact with one another, voice their opinions, but for it to be curated in such a way where it's about making points of contact, where it's like a network effect where everybody is able to find the right people that they need to get things done when they need to get it done. Who's the person I gotta talk to? Who's the expert in this field? Who has experience in this realm? who's been through this before, who's willing to give support, who's willing to, show up and put some effort in, whatever. I very much model it off of the idea of how protesters were able to advantage the technology of Twitter when it was Twitter to establish the Arab Spring, for people to organize and come together to be able to form actionable organization to get things done specifically. I think that would be really important to be able to do, because when you look at it, there's lots of protests that are happening right now. People are outraged about what POTUS 47 is doing, and I really don't blame them. I'm right there with you. But rather than, going out and organizing protests and getting people involved, of showing up and holding up signs and getting people to honk as they go by, and, why not be able to organize that same productivity and capacity and energy and enthusiasm and intelligence and capabilities and ingenuity and put it towards getting things done, so that we don't continuously look at government for the answers or the solutions, but it's working as what I like to call the public-private partnership, which isn't just private, like private companies, but the private citizen, the private individual, and the public, so government as a whole, working together to solve for things that we need to get done, because the government recognizes this probably is something that we shouldn't be in charge of, because you don't want that much decision-making power concentrated into the hands of a few, especially when they're so many degrees separated from the reality of, how that's actually going to play out in the real world scenario. We should be empowering the lowest concentration of power, which is the individual in the local and the relevant stakeholders in the localities, and that the federal government is just able to amass the capacity for orchestration of organization and, facilitation and, kind of almost like, we provide this social media platform, this public town square, this digitized town square. We provide that for you for organization. We also provide the algorithms that help you to search and find for the people that you need. And that we empower you with how to get a hold of all of the resources, the implements, the tools, the things that you need to accomplish that and get it done. And then also give you some sort of, backing for saying, because of your efforts, you're going to get a return on your efforts. Not necessarily saying that's going to be, an income compensation, but, we're going to operate off of a reciprocity sort of system in this. I think that if we can do that, where the government now just becomes this, great steward of the capacity for the people to do good for themselves, and then a means for everybody to come together to voice their opinions and for it to be heard on merits. Like, what you say in these platforms matters, so of course you're not coming there and, attacking people and being mean to them or bullying them or, saying fucked up things about them or intimidating them, these sorts of things. But rather coming in for constructive, conversation, constructive criticism, constructive feedback, to have a site source for inquiry and to be able to get an immediate response, because the system knows who to go to send the question to, and then to bring it back to you and say relevancy, And I know that this, of course, would be based off of a system that is intelligent in a way that artificially constructs all that information and condenses it down and brings to people. But I don't believe that that system should be created by people who have already proven themselves incapable of having a peaceable, platform like, X. I don't think that the creators of any sort of artificial system should come from people who have already proven themselves incapable of conscious consideration for the outcomes of their actions, or compassion, or care, concern about others, or a capacity to orient to any, ideal that is beyond self-centeredness. But I believe that, this would be able to be created, this great platform for everybody in America to come together and to be a part of this building out America together. It gives resource, agency, capital to everybody. Again, bringing the power to the lowest concentration of power to the local level, so it's less capacity to be corrupt. And then corrective mechanisms on every layer, going up until the point where then you have an ascending level of, moderation that comes in to intervene on your behalf. You have to have the appropriate intercession when it's necessary, but never if it's not, sort of thing. To not infringe, right, on people's rights and liberties to self-govern and self-determine. I think this would be really important. And then I see the greatest value of it is like this would be able to be a platform for people to give voice to their reason and their beliefs and their way of orienting and their understanding and how things are actually impacting their lives, and to be able to talk on matters of importance that are about us finding solutions to the problems that we are facing, present day, our contemporary image, and how we are trying to orient that into a reasonable concept of the picture of what we're trying to get at here. What's the problem? Where's the solution? How can we get at it? And I think creating something like that in an intentional, intelligible, reasonable way would be a great way to create I view it as it would be like a universal basic innovation that everybody could have direct access to. The hardest part would be connectivity, making sure that we have connectivity that reaches every corner of the nation. We would absolutely have to upgrade our connectivities in rural areas. It's going to take a lot of work, time, effort, energy, and these sorts of things, but absolutely worth it, because we would need to get as many people involved in it as possible so they're connected. It's kind of similar to, how most people have a phone. We need to get to the point where most all people have direct line access to this network. And I don't necessarily think, excuse me, that would have to be on the internet per se, because there's various and interesting ways to not have to have everything, in the cloud all the time, and that for things to be transferable, but not necessarily having to be through an internet system. I kind of think there will be a time that's not too far off in the future where, the concept of sending up satellites is going to be very antiquated, because of the notion of, like, first of all, let's not throw that much space junk, to enclose ourselves in with and then have it come crashing down to Earth. And we don't need that type of, stupidity of just throwing resources in for waste up into space all the time, when we have a capacity to develop entire expansive network systems here on Earth with not as many resources as it would take to build an entire, network system in space, which is also a very limited thing because of the whole, there's only a few ways to get up there, whereas there are many different ways to get around the Earth and to build things tangible here. And then I guess thinking about wanting to make sure that people feel they have a safe space to go to is really important to me. I mean, seeing that we have some of our favorite voices in America that are being silenced. If you had a network where it's insularly protected against the government coming in, like, you can't fuck with the system, man. It's already set in place and everybody's involved. You can't stop it. It's not meant to be stopped. It's meant to exist and, in its fullness. It would be a way to preserve and protect the First Amendment. I think that this is really important because I think once we set that in stone, we set that in place, that is on lock, it's solid, it is a true constant, then we'll be able to have actually a natural resolution to the problem of people overreacting to when they're being silenced. Because there's a sure way that your voice will be heard. There's a way for you to show up in the world and people are not going to be able to, take that away from you. You're not going to be intimidated or bullied or, forced into silence, these sorts of things. And especially knowing that the government isn't going to be able to come in and say you're not allowed to say something, people won't have the, reaction like, well, fuck you for telling me what to do, sort of thing, or telling me what I can't say. But then we'll also be able to have the conscious, coherent conversations about, what is truth. And I think that comes into the idea we need to have more people that are able to say, like, for instance, I always like to reference COVID because that was it was one of the big shockers in our lifetime, right? Woke everybody up to how very fragile our reality is. But during the times of COVID, there were a lot of uncertainties about what was going on, and then there were people that were trying to voice their opinions about COVID, the approach to COVID, they didn't approve of vaccinations, or they thought there might have been alternative, remedies to it. People voicing the fact that they did not like being forced to stay in their homes. The fact that they were feeling themselves be forcibly impoverished by the government who wasn't letting them be productive. People who were upset about being forced to wear a mask because it was infringing on their personal liberties, I shouldn't have to do anything you tell me to do, sort of thing. Which in the case is just you wear a seatbelt because, we were told wearing a seatbelt is going to increase the likelihood of you surviving if something bad ends up happening, if an accident happens. In case shit happens, wear a seatbelt. And that's kind of what wearing a mask was. And so, the argument against that really wasn't sensical, but the fact that people were turning it into a point of contention to the point where, they were willing to go all out anarchy with the world because they didn't have to wear a mask, because they didn't like the fact that they thought government was telling them what to do. And so, but that sort of situation, and the fact that you have reasonable scientists that are listen, guys, we don't know all the answers, but we do know this much. And this is based on facts and truth and verifiable evidence and, this sort of stuff. And so we really have to listen to the science because it is our best eyes and ears, it's our best way of knowing. like based off of our, capacity to be sensible about the world and know how the earth works and, how things that exist on earth work. This is what we're saying is the most reasonable understanding of what we're going through, and what logic then tells us is the most likely outcome if we do things in certain specific ways. It gives us a list of variables to be considerate of and a list of potential tunes that may result from, various actions we could take or inactions that we choose not to take, and that in order to engineer the best outcome, that would of course be to, get out of this crisis and to not have to worry about this life or death situation, reduce human suffering, keep everybody as safe and sound as possible, these sorts of things. This is what we should do based on intelligence. But then people be able to come in and say, but my lived experience is different than what you're saying. And then for there to be a comparison between what science tells us based off of their, predictive analysis, logical thinking, and then the realities of what the lived experience is for the individual, and be able to say, well, maybe we don't have to be so extreme in that way. Maybe we could find best practices by just listening to the voice of the people who are telling us, things could be different. It works for me. I've tried it this way. Let people experiment and try different things, and then let them be willing to assume the risk if they want to, in cases where it's like we see that there's ways to take reasonable precautions that will still let us to be able to go to work and to run our businesses and stuff. Let us do those sorts of things instead of you just doing a blanket generalization of like, shut everything down. And because of that, we had obviously, there was a lot of really negative social implications to that, and a lot of the reason why people are attacking science right now is because of this very bad decision of how they chose to go about it, and trying to like come in and say, just do what we say because we know the answers, instead of getting people to have the opportunity to voice their opinion and feel like they're heard and they're cared about and they're cared for, and you're working together to find a solution. That would have been the best approach, because it would have reduced the amount of fear and anger and frustration and, backlash and everything. But a platform as what I'm talking about will be able to solve for that, in a sense of the people will be able to come share their lived experience and then be able to provide insights of like, well, this may be a way for us to approach this that's effective, because like every community, every household, every state tried different ways of reintegrating back into normalcy afterwards, and their recovery rate and like how they recovered very differently, and their mortality rate very differently based off of the different practices that they took. And we should have a platform by which we can bring all that information together so we can find best practices and to be able to resolve for things as soon as possible. But the biggest thing is to make sure that people know that they're being heard, they're being cared for, and they're being cared about, because they'll be able to solve for these things most effectively, because the response isn't going to be out of a irrational fear and frustration of like, no, wait a second, you can't stop me from, what do you mean you're taking my freedoms away? But just rather like, okay, what would you do in this case if, given what we know about the situation, and knowing what your needs are and your wants are in this situation, what sort of risks are you willing to assume, and how is that going to impact those around you? And to be consciously aware of that. And we would be able to have the information and the details about that if we had a platform that was intentionally made to coordinate in that capacity. I think that that's going to be give us a transformative experience for government. I think that would really help us to achieve the more direct democracy this would be able to help to, actualize a new amendment to the Constitution, which would add a civics branch of government in all of those interworkings, would be this like established platform. And then for that to give direct line access to, informing the systems. So decision makers are operating based off of now relevant information. They're getting the full picture. They'll be able to take all of the information of all their constituents and be able to see how it plays out. And then be able to do predictive scenarios of like what would be the best case situation, and then pass that information back to their constituents to say, does this sound reasonable? And then they can advance it forward into the next round of, conscious consideration in terms of like how we inform policies. And then again into, as I've spoken on before, the concept of the peace, which is the president's everything assistant coordinating executive discretion. It's literally about helping them to decide what is the right thing to do, what is the next thing that needs to be done, and what's the right thing to do right now that is, in the right way for the right reasons, in the right timing, so that not only are the people able to, know that their voice is going to be heard, but know that it's going to ascend into, the decision making of the president, so it reflects what the people need. And when I think about it, like, I wonder what our current administration would be like if we had something like that. Even with it being Trump being POTUS 47, I think that it would help us in a sense where it could be the direct, anti-corruption mechanism that we obviously need right now, because Trump is a very corrupt man. I think that he is lacking a moral legitimacy and a fabric of integrity by which he operates off of. I don't think he's ever spent time personal development of a soul print value system and for him to align with. And so what we see is his erratic, nonsensical, whimsical kind of approach to things. And, that might be effective for a TV personality, but it's certainly destructive and self-defeating for a president. But even at that, imagining what he would be able to do and what we, the people, would be able to do if we had such a technology already existing and was implemented right now in government. I think that we wouldn't have, there would be no government coming in and, the president suing TV stations and newspapers for reporting on facts that did not cast him in favorable light. I think that we probably wouldn't have a dismantling of our social security systems and our social welfare systems. Our environmental protection agency would be integrity bound and upheld. It would probably be expanded, create efficiencies in the systems. That's what this is all about. Like, when I see everything, I always see inefficiencies in systems. And, when you think of government, it's like efficient government is almost like an oxymoron. But it could be potentially possible. And I mean, imagine if enough people were able to voice their dissatisfaction, that it's not just going out in the street and protesting and then Trump feeling the pressure of that and then having to respond because he doesn't want there to be a full-on revolt, grab your pitchforks sort of thing. But imagine if there was a way for people to voice their opinion that actually had a working solution built into it that actually functions as a corrective mechanism to shift tides and change things. It's kind of like, if you were able to, you have 5 different channels and every person has a single like marble, and you can drop it into whichever channel that you want to elect for, and whichever one fills up the fastest is obviously the one that should get advanced first and foremost. I kind of think of it similar to rank choice voting, where it's like, okay, this is the greatest idea, we should advance this one, obviously, or it's like, it seems kind of obvious, but it's too close to call, so then let's recount it based off of, these are obviously the ones people are more, all in for, and then determine based off of the redistribution of the ones that weren't, as favorable, knock it down from 5 to the 3 top ones, and then determine which one, once the redistribution based off of the second favorite one from the people that had to have their, first choice wasn't a part of, the final count, redistributed into its second choice, then you decide, okay, from there, is there a defining, distinguishment that says this is the most likely one? If not, do the countdown again, shrinking it down to 2, and then there will be one distinct definitive winner in the end, sort of thing. And then understanding that as kind of like a way of being able to determine more likely the will of the people in this regard. But then again, saying like there has to be a corrective mechanism that steps in at some point before the final decision's made and say, I'm a relevant stakeholder and I object to this, and this is why. And for that to be considered and heard on the merits, so we know the truth of it all, so we can say, well, in light of this information, would I still make that decision? And if people would vote out of favor and say, maybe I don't want to vote for the other person that was like next in line, but I certainly don't want to vote for that person anymore, then it could trigger a recount, sort of thing. I think that having that sort of thing gives us the most realistic, workable, framework for our direct democracy, and having a platform for that to be all distinguished out. And then also the reasonableness of where it's not just like, I'm the relevant stakeholder, I come to the table, I speak my mind, and then we all, reconfirm our decision from there, but rather also having a debate. I don't get that. This is something I never really understood about this government, which of course I see as a total inefficiency of the system, is like, why don't we have in every single decision making, why are we not having everything debated on the merits? What kind of illogical, nonsensical, ignorant bullshit are we getting ourselves into by allowing laws to be passed by representatives that don't even read what the laws are, or the fact that they bunch all of these things in together all at once just to get it through? And it's like, they don't recognize that it's like one bad apple spoils the bunch, sort of thing. They don't care. Like, I don't understand that. I never understood how policy could be created without having to pass through the will of the people first, for them to make the distinction that this is what we want, and for it to be, crafted in an intelligible way by legislators themselves, not crazy lobbyists, that are special interests and don't give a fuck about, excuse my language again, the people, but rather, their own personal interests, the people who are paying them. Why can't we have the people themselves being the ones that created the laws? I mean, that's what a civics branch of government is all about. The people make the laws. They say, this is what I want as a law. This is what I want it to do. This is what I want it to have as a corrective mechanism. This is how I want to be able to, voice my grievances. This is how I want to be able to trigger an event of recall or reconsideration, and how we can have a regular debate of, coming back, like, is this still relevant? And debate that on the merits with one another to say, like, I claim to be a relevant stakeholder in this situation, and I'm opposed to this for these reasons, and for people to, debate that out. Bring all of your inputs and your insights, your perspective, perceptions, propositions, your orientation in the situation, in the historical and the fine context, and say, this is what I think would be reasonable. Or like, I don't want that to happen because I see it will hurt me in this way. And they'd be like, oh, I didn't think of it. I've never put myself in your shoes. Now I can, because I can see what your shoes look like, and doing that, okay, maybe we can shift it in this way, or maybe we can make an accommodation in this way, or maybe we can provision in this way, maybe we can support in this way, would then it be reasonable? That sort of thing. And we only know that stuff if we debate it on the merits, But again, it goes to the whole thing, like, we shouldn't be debating forever. We have to have a way to reasonably conclude things in an efficient, timely manner. But once you do that, then pass it to the legislators, who are literally supposed to be, these people should be storytellers, craftsmen in the art of oratory and writing, and to be able to capture ideas in their fullness and express them with authenticity and integrity and enlightened insight, and then pass that into a law that says, only one at a time. And I know, I get it, like, there's so much that we have to do, and there's only so much time, and legislators have their own lives they have to live, and blah, 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 all this other stuff. Well, this network would be able to help them do most of their job from home. And then they only have to come back, you could do most of this stuff from a distance. And this would save so much for the taxpayers to not have to pay for the travel of legislators constantly, that they only go for the final, through, let's come together and then discuss this in the final say or whatever, and then advance it through, sort of thing. Like, it seems more reasonable if we were approaching direct democracy, and we need it now more than ever. This is the antidote. This is the remedy for what Trump is doing. He's trying to bring a authoritarian dictatorship to America to replace, the democratic system that we've had long standing. And most people are not okay with that. I know I'm not okay with that. But the obvious remedy to that is to offer the better solution of a more direct democracy, more direct involvement of the people in self-government, more direct impact that they have on, the legislative bodies, more direct impact that they have on the informing of the executive branch, and also more direct impact in terms of a corrective mechanism for, the judicial branch. Because, well, I think it's kind of funny, like, they are actually the most powerful branch. They are willingly subjecting themselves in full submission to Trump, so they're giving away their power to him, which is exactly what Congress is doing. They're just bending their power and giving it to Trump, and that's why we're getting this amass power up into to the president position, so it becomes more and more a dictatorship as every day, with every passing day. But we also need to have corrective mechanisms for the Supreme Court, especially for the fact that you shouldn't be able to bribe judges, and also like a standard of consistency for the fact that, our justice system cannot claim to be a just system if the way law is applied depends on your socioeconomic class or status, or your race, or your gender, or your sexual orientation. There's literally so much discrimination deeply embedded in the judicial branch of government. And a civics branch would be able to help to be a corrective mechanism for that, to help to keep them honest, fair, and true. Let's just take, for instance, the recent story about the young lady who was gunned down by a police officer, Breonna Taylor, I believe is what her name was, and a wholly tragic situation, obviously never should have happened, and so many Black lives are cut short by police that are lacking the sufficient enforceable rein in on their power so that they do not use it in an exploitive way to do violence against certain peoples. But in that particular case, it really broke my heart to hear that, the supposed Department of Justice is willing to give the officer that was found guilty of shooting this woman, taking her life, that he was only going to serve a single day of jail time. And that's not justice at all. That is in no way going to make the victim whole, and it is no way going to make the perpetrator whole. That perpetrator now thinks there is no consequences to his actions, that he gets to walk off scot-free, essentially, from what he did, just because he's a police officer, and we protect the blue. And it's like, yeah, totally respect that. But that respect is not just a given. All respect is earned. All respect is earned. And the fact that this woman is now not going to be able to rest in peace because, the person who did violence to her cut her life short, no longer has to do anything to restitute, to recompense, or to redeem. Not in any way are they made to have to go through like corrective training or to have to go and give, time and service to the community to help to, train police officers to not make poor choices and to not be biased and to be consciously aware of their own biases, or to go out into the community and do service to help to mend the rift that now has been created between the relationship of the police, which are supposed to be serving and protecting the community, and the community themselves that fear the police. Like, there should be some sort of corrective mechanism like that honors this woman's living memory, to say that, we're not trying to pass this off like this didn't happen or this wasn't a thing or it doesn't matter. Like, we care enough to set things right. And that's not what's happening. Instead, they're hiding it, and sending a very loud and distinct signal that that if the police do something wrong, there's no corrective mechanism to prevent them from doing wrong and getting away with it. And how much more fear is that instilling in the population to think that these people who are supposed to be there to serve and protect their communities, their community servants, are no longer serving the interests of the people, but rather serving the interests of a higher power or authority, or their own sense of that I have the higher power and authority, and what are you going to do about it? Giving them that type of power is a terribly dangerous thing to do. Again, going back to that book, The Locust Effect. So many police officers exploit and abuse their power, and they murder and they rape and they steal and they traffic drugs and they traffic people, and they intimidate people and throw people in jail who try to call them out on their bullshit and stuff like that. Like, we're creating that type of state of fear in America, by the Department of Justice allowing this person to get off with just one day of jail. It makes such a mockery of the institutions of justice. It does a disservice to that woman and her family and her living memory, and it sets a terrible precedence for more harm to be done in the future. because there's no corrective mechanism. The corrective mechanism has been neutered. And that is a consistent theme through everything that Trump is doing. He is neutering every corrective mechanism that we've long established. He is distorting the sense of justice. His sense of jurisprudence is, shifting everything to say only the people with money, power, and influence have rights to laws and the protections of the law. I'm really not okay with that. But I think that, again, having this system would be able to create a corrective mechanism, because let's just imagine all the people who are obviously very pissed off that this police officer is going to get 1 day of prison, 1 day of going to jail for an entire life that he eradicated from the face of this earth. Granted, from a mistake, but he has no sense that he has to correct that mistake, all of the people that are outraged about that could, in an intelligible system of direct democracy and a civics branch, be able to step in and say, actually, we're not okay with that outcome. And while we, as the people in the civics branch, may not be able to send that man to prison for an extended period of time, we could petition the Department of Justice to reconsider what they're doing, and to bog them down with petition as a means to get them to change their decision making, but also create social sanctioning. So in this case, be like, within the civics branch, there's also the establishment of portions tax, which could say that you could, in a way, be able to remove some of the taxes that would go to be able to fund the police department, and force them to change their funding so that they have to now pay more funding for training to alleviate biases, more training for vetting of, biases and people of potential mental illness that would exploit power, more training to be able to make the police officers less reactive to situations where they may, respond with force greater than what is necessary because they are not prepared to face the situation, because they are not trained to effectively deal with those situations. I think a big part of this would be solving with education, but the corrective social sanctioning mechanism through the civics branch would be able to, through the portions tax, say, we would be able to effectively sanction the police officer so that he has to go through corrective training, sort of thing, and that the people could vote and choose on that, and for it to be based off of, a legitimate display of the merits. And so that also gives the people a way to show up and advocate for themselves and say, these are the facts of the matter. These are the facts of what happened, not just what limited, skewed view was able to come out in the courts. And the reason why this, I believe, would be okay in society, because again, it's not going back to what I was talking about, a while ago about cancel culture or whatever. It actually creates a refinement to the sense of cancel culture and gives it more sensible and sensibilities to it and reasonableness. So it's an instrument for righteousness instead of a tool of, chaos and mayhem and in disorganization and disintegration of our domestic order, but rather an instrument for establishing our domestic order, to be able to say we should be able to socially sanction people in these ways, but doing so through this very specific corrective mechanism. So it's all done out with transparency, so people know why we're doing it and in the ways that we're doing it. And so there is a reasonableness of justification behind it. There is an orientation of jurisprudence that any person coming from the outside looking at it based on the merits would say, that's just, fair, reasonable, and right. And for the people to have that type of corrective mechanisms, they could step in where if a judge says, this is the sentence I'm going to give you a day, the people can step in and say, yeah, but we are going to create a corrective mechanism in another way, because it's important for us that you reintegrate back into society, and this is how we feel that's going to best happen, in a way that's like peaceful and reasonable and whatnot. Again, with any system, there's always the potential where people can turn into a tool of evil, even if it has the best intentions for righteousness. The fact that of having all parties that are relevant stakeholders to be involved in it, and for there be layers of checks and balances on it, and for even the justice system to come in and say, okay, that aligns reasonably, these sorts of things, at least that sense of involvement could be a way to make that victim whole. Because instead of it being just like, we don't care, one day you're off with a slap on the wrist, there was meaningful, intentional, redemption, rectification, and restoration of the integrities of that situation. And especially if it's done in a way that isn't this corrective mechanism, it's not about damning the person who made the mistake, the violator, it's not trying to punish him and make him suffer and, judge him with vengeance or something like that. No, it's literally about, what you did was not the right thing, and we need to do something to correct for that, so that that though you made a mistake, you aren't a mistake, you are a person that's flawed, and that there are ways to redeem yourself, in order that you don't live out in this state of PTSD that you would have from knowing that you did this thing, and then not us coming out and attacking you like you're a villain in the situation, so that doesn't inflame your PTSD even worse and then make you even more of a threat to society, but rather saying what you did was wrong and never should have happened, and then do what's necessary to correct for that. I think that as long as we're looking at having a civics branch of government that has this intentional, public platform that everybody can involve with, and then our capacity to take corrective steps when we see that different branches of the government are, not actually doing their jobs, and we need to intervene on their behalf, so that we can better represent ourselves with self-governance. And then for that to have a direct line of communication to our legislative bodies and to our executive branch, and then a corrective mechanism to make sure that our, legal system is not being, corrupted by briberies or special interests and these sorts of things. I think having that type of system is a way to really liberate us in a way that was never possible before we reached this level of communication and connectivity. And having this reasonable network to be able to do that, and to have it in a way that's, everybody building it together, it is it's a decentralized protocol that is able to, bring in this network effect of different nodes of, organized interests and whatnot, to be able to come together and in a way for them to, coalesce around certain ideas to advance them forward so that we can get progress in particular areas. It would give so much more of a capacity for us to be effective and responsive to the will of the people, and to integrate the full voice of the people, than just, using just the justice system, because it is an imperfect system. And if anything, we need to be able to take some of the weight off of that system, so we can kind of with the lessened weight on it, then be able to really do the work of cleaning it up and improving the system to be more responsive to, upholding the Constitution, like the original spirit of intent of our justice system was supposed to be. Really, I think having a fourth branch is going to help us to be able to orient. I like to think of it as, right now we have like a tripod, right? We have the 3-branch system, and it's sitting and it's stable, yes, because it's the most simple structure in the universe is a triangulation, but we need to have, we're complex, humanity is very complex. We need to have a coordination, which means that we need to be able to have an orientation that gives us parallels, gives us a way to condense and divide. And I see it very much like the orientation of the Vitruvian Man, where you have the square and then you have the circle and then you have the man, in the center of it. And that perfect calculation is able to give us an understanding of man's place, human's place in the universe. And that type of structural organization, I think, is more important, because you should make things simple, but never only as simple as they need to be. And I think that having a 3-branch system is an oversimplification of what it is this nation is trying to get at in terms of being an ever more perfect union. We need to have a new type of arrangement, new type of orientation, new type of alignments. And that a 4th branch will help us to associate better. It will give us a more dynamic, overview of the scenario universe to which we're working in. And then knowing how each part has an important role to play, and associations to that part which have, an interlocking, interweaving effect. And mostly for the fact that, we are a growing and vast nation, like in a nation of vast diversities and whatnot. And the only way to accurately represent and reflect that diversity is for us to be able to have a means for that diversity to be thoroughly, accurately, authentically, honestly, uninhibited, unabashedly expressed within our government system. And so I'm hoping that we can get to that point, because I really believe that that's going to be a way to preserve and protect our First Amendment. It's going to help us to make sure that we have freedom of speech and freedom of press, that nobody would feel like they're being silenced. Sure, I'm perfectly fine with us having social media have moderations, and that social media companies should be held accountable to the content that they allow to proliferate on their platforms, because they are essentially turning into cesspools for violence against people to be done, not just in the digital realms, but then to move out into the real world spaces. And this is a real, genuine, authentic threat to the sanctity of our domestic order, global stability, and our sensibilities of what is good humanity. But again, in a corrective measure way, not in a sense of like punishing. But there needs to be a check and balance system so that these people don't think they can just get away with this. There has to be a way to reasonably rein in, these technologies so that they don't get out of hand, because it's kind of like the Pandora's box. Once you open it, you can't put everything back in it, but we can build a bigger box. And I think that that's where we're at in terms, especially with adding artificial intelligence into these systems. It's going to be a whole lot more of a threat to civilization than I think people are currently aware of. But that sort of corrective mechanism should be in place. But then still, again, having the free space for people to speak their mind on things in through the government, so that when their voice matters in a situation, in a circumstance, it's going to be heard. Because you got to think, a platform can choose to silence your voice if it wants to. There's social media companies that focus everything around advancing certain types of narratives or certain keywords. And they'll, anybody who they don't want to, if you don't like that particular person, you can, shadow ban them or whatever, and then they don't have a voice anymore. And that, because that's that company, and that's how that company chooses to operate, is in these, sinister, dark, and pathetic ways. But, so when you have something to voice that is of importance, it's not going to be heard on those platforms because it's based off of the will and the whims of the creators. In a scenario where it's, a platform that is decentralized and we all operate and work on, and it all is interconnected together, you can't really be silenced for the fact that, you're disfavored in some algorithm, but rather like your considerations are amplified based off of their relevancy as being a stakeholder and your adherence to like truths and reality. And even if it's not adhered to what, logic and science tells us is truth and reality, what are your arguments of facts that could suggest that there is a, consideration of an alternate reality than what, science tells us? Because maybe there is a more wholesome truth that we're not aware of. Bring that to our attention, sort of thing. But be willing to back it up with facts instead of just saying, I don't have to prove myself. This is just, everybody should just know this is the truth, sort of thing. Like, you have to be able to come out at it with reasonableness, because we want to be informed of your insights and your perspective, if they're real and if they're true and if they're honest. So having a platform that that your voice will be heard, I think it would be an invaluable asset to the transformation of our nation into an ever more perfect union, to restore the integrities and to save us from, this downward spiral into a dog eat dog, mighty crush the weak, free for all hellscape that, the MAGA movement has been drowning us in for years, And then, like, in the case of, again, having with the President of the United States informing, members of his administration and, heads of agencies that are supposed to be independent, telling them how to respond to, certain, in light of recent events, cases of like breaking news and things like that, for him to like tell everybody you either have to, approach this the way that I say, or, you're against me, sort of thing. It just makes no sense why we are entrusting ourselves to accept an alternate version of reality from somebody who can't even keep his story straight, and it's not like, he's adding more to be able to form a more coherent story. It's like one thought to the next, he has no idea what he's even talking about. And then people will ask him questions about something, and instead of answering the most direct question that is given to him, he throws it off into left field. And then people are like, huh, what are you talking about right now? Like, where did that come from? There's a lot of that, And I think ever more than ever, we have to notice the fact that he's getting older and older and less capable of upholding the duties of his office. And this is a very dangerous place to be into, because, him, being found incapable of performing his duties, the next in line would be his vice president, who is a to the soul core not good person. He is morally distorted and is very feeble in terms of, his place in the world. The only thing that he has to hold on to is his sense of he's been given power and he is not going to let go of it. And he got that power only by being spineless and servile and, sleazy and, incoherent in terms of he was all for being against Trump, and now all of a sudden he loves Trump because he saw some sort of change in Trump, but in the reality of things, he saw that Trump was his meal ticket to get into a higher chain of power, and he was willing to say whatever he needed to do in order to get into that position. And his perspective on what he thinks America should become is not based off of having a vision of integrity, it's of caring about everybody. It is supreme isolation, and it is very much only caring about the higher echelons, the deviant echelon of society. He doesn't care about everyday people. He literally says that he interprets, his religious interpretation is that we shouldn't care about other people. We got to take care of ourselves first and basically screw everybody else. And to me, that's probably one of the worst interpretations ever, where people take religion to say that, in the Bible, it literally says that you're supposed to, care first for those who are in the house of faith. And the concept where it gets perverted, which is very much where the vice president has taken it, is the sense of take care of our own first, and then, that's what's most important, and then you worry about everybody else if you can, sort of thing. That whole entire interpretation is a gross misrepresentation of the story of the Good Samaritan, which is supposed to be you don't determine whether or not you help somebody or not based off of first knowing whether or not where their alliances and their allegiances lie. It literally is no different than what the Nazis did in pasting a star onto Jews to be able to identify them so they can be easily discriminated against. Or the concept that I was saying earlier, it's not like we wear tags on our vests to say I am a citizen, so people don't try to abduct me, and throw me into a concentration camp here in America because I'm of a different colored skin. It is literally, he's operating off of that same concept of that there's certain identifiable markers by which they and an us, and we only are going to worry about us because they are going to hold us back and hold us down, instead of the sense of we're all in this together. And the more of us that are involved in this cooperative, sense of pathological togetherness, we are able to, achieve the, art of living together in cities, which is what civilization development's all about. Living together in society and growing and cultivating and establishing domestic order, ensuring our domestic tranquility, and you don't get domestic tranquility when you're constantly us versus them. Even when I say, the MAGA cohort or those who align with Trump, I'm not thinking in my head of a certain specific person that I'm going to be able to point out and say you're the bad guy. I'm saying in the generalization, those who align with this sense that it's okay to, be cruel and indifferent to human suffering and, strip the dignity of human beings and to make everything about money and be willing to lie and deceive others and to the point where those people then are operating off of lies and they're living in a deception and leading them astray. I'm not okay with that. And if you are consciously aware that that's what you're about and that's what you're doing, you're telling a lie, you're part of the deviant echelon of society. And I'm not about, I'm not on your side. I'm on the side of those who are part of the criterion echelon of society. And those within the MAGA cohort or those who are aligned with Trump who are waking up to the reality that maybe those things that he said that he was going to do, he never really meant he was ever going to do them, or the way in which he's going to approach doing them because he doesn't really have any sensibilities, capacities, skills, reasonableness. He's going to go about doing it in an inhumane and cruel way, and that those who would rather not align with that sort of thing, I'm on your side, I think that the vice president being a potential, ascending into the office of president because Trump will become incapacitated puts us in a really dangerous place because of the fact that the vice president is very much in the deviant echelon of society and has no desire to ever leave it, because in that place is the only place that he has power, because that's where he got his power, that's where his power exists. It is wholly dependent on that reality, and outside of that, he is nothing more than a guy who is willing to change like a chameleon in order to fit in, to be socially accepted with people. He has no integrity of his policies, and his moral legitimacy is based off of a gross interpretation of, the original spirit of intent of, even the founding of the religion that he, claims to follow. And, because the whole idea is like the original intent was about love, always love. And love in a, solicitous regard, love in an unconditional way, love in a surrender, love in an acceptance, love in deep layers of forgiveness. And he's very much a punishment person. There's no forgiveness in what he aligns and orients with. And I think he's very much a part of we got to look at the world in terms of what we can do to others, instead of like, what can we do for others? And there is something inherently corrupt about him that is seeping from his pores of radiating evil. And I think it's because he fails to have the right moderating influence, because he fails to do any sense of personal self-development. But again, it's not like he doesn't have capacity to redeem himself, but he certainly isn't going to do that if power just keeps getting handed to him. And if he comes into office and we didn't elect him into office, he's not beholden to anybody. How did he get his position of becoming vice president? It wasn't because, he was faithful servant to the American people. He was, willing to be the sycophant to Trump and the yes man to Trump and do whatever Trump says, in order to get into that position of power. So it's not based off of him doing something that is, really reasonable, like his approach to wanting to make, America even great. It was just like make himself powerful. And I think that is even more dangerous than what Trump is, especially because of how, the vice president is trying to get himself in the good graces of all these other people in power, because again, the deviant echelon, self-reinforcing system of corruption, that they need each other, very much like Trump's trying to save and protect his own ass, and so is everybody else in his little cohort. And that's why they aren't saying anything about the Epstein files, is because if word gets out about what they're really doing and what they've really done, the whole world would turn against them, And so I think that we're in a really, really difficult situation. I think that there is potential for recognizing that this is a fault in our system that needs to be corrected through the establishment of the civics branch of government, where we can trigger an election before an election year to be able to move people out of office that shouldn't be there, and to be able to make it not just be the president, but if necessary, the vice president or any other members of his cabinet, because of the fact that if they continue to persist in what they are doing, you don't know where their allegiance and alliances lie. I think that it's kind of similar to what Trump is doing with trying to, get people out of certain agencies and whatnot and replace them with his, people that are loyalists to him or whatever. That kind of like gives the justification why we would have to do something like that. When you see somebody that's coming in that are making agencies that are supposed to be dependent and firing people that are, career politicians, people that have been, in their roles and are very good at the work that they do, in many cases thankless work, but absolutely necessary, getting removed from those positions and replaced with people that are not skilled, not talented, and have no idea what they're doing, just because their only qualification is, are you going to be in allegiance to Trump? Okay, if you are, then you're in, sort of thing. We should be able to correct for those sorts of things when it happens. It's being like, no, you don't have the right to do that. You don't have the right to take those people out of those positions and just replace them with, your little plants. And I think that having the capacity for the civics branch to be able to call those things out, to prevent them from happening, and not just the path of recourse for, trying to, sue in court to prevent that from happening. I think the people themselves should be able to say, hey, no, that's not okay. And then on the merits, there would have to be a justification as to why they're firing them, not just based off of, I need people to be in allegiance with me, or, some fake thing about, oh, we need to save money or something like that. Like, what's your real legitimate justification? And let the people know that on the merits, and then let them say whether or not they're willing to let their tax money go to still funding that program or keeping those people in office or whatever. And to let those people to be able to argue on the merits of, like, I should be able to keep my job because I'm good at it. Just because I don't align with you doesn't mean that I shouldn't be able to keep my job. But at the same time, it's like, but are you there just because you're trying to work an agenda of, loyalties to one man, or loyalties to, a movement that's trying to literally forcefully overthrow our government from the inside, which is exactly what's happening with Trump and the entire MAGA movement. Excuse me. That's the sign that I need to stop talking, obviously, because I've been going for so long, but I wanted to be able to give voice to this sense of, I don't like that America's losing its voice. I don't like that, people are being silenced, and that the press is being attacked, and that, social media is being skewed to prevent, all voices to be heard reasonably. And the fact that people are realizing that less and less is the case that the government is responsive to their needs and their wants. And I think that we need to change that. I know that there's potential in the things that I'm suggesting. The biggest thing is to recognize that any system that is created needs to be created in a transparent way, and that it really will require an entire reset of the system. But because it's going to be an entire reset of the system, of integrating this in, that should all be done very transparently. There are going to be some things that are, necessary to not be, wholly publicized because of the fact of matters of national security. But never should it be like what Trump's trying to do, is claim everything is national security, when it's basically just he needs to hide the shame of the bad things that they're doing. But understanding there's a reasonable amount of information that people do not need to know in order for their best interest to be served. In fact, them knowing is probably not in their best interest, because then it puts us in a dangerous situation. But most things that even the civics branch would involve with should be transparent. And the development of that out in the open lessens the chance for corruption and helps us to establish, a conscious collective conversation about its development, so that we can, create the corrective, weed out the unlikelies and fix the bugs in the system as they appear or whatever. But the biggest thing is to understand that no matter what, from evermore and after, until we change the system, we have deeply embedded corruption in the current systems, and we have artificial intelligence that's being embedded into the systems right now that is infiltrating, our most private informations. And because of that, it is a risk and a threat to the sanctity of our institution of government. And so if we are not able to go in and do a clean sweep and a reset, then basically it is like a backdoor hacker came in, and now there's no way to separate that from the situation. And because of that, we have to recognize that those who are building those systems, those who are correcting those systems, those who made the original source code for those systems, lacking the integrity of just decent, good humanity, and they're proof that, the systems just literally right before they've been fully integrated into the systems have been twisted and perverted, to do terrible things and say terrible things. It's proof enough that it's not trustworthy. It's just not trustworthy. And that if we can all agree that we need to have a reset and that it would be in our best interest to make it most transparent, I think that it would help to settle the fears of many people that have always been concerned about there being a dark and sinister state. It's like, now we the people with the civics branch and these appropriate, integrations of systems of network connectivity into the system, we would be able to shine a little bit more light, so that we would be more aware, more conscious, more capable of informing the system and being informed by it. And I think that we would have a whole lot more domestic order in that regard. But as it stands now, there's no transparency, there's no corrective mechanisms, the people don't have a say, it's just concentrated powers pulling the strings and skewing systems into their favor, and then amassing information to be able to use against you in order to suppress you. And it's not right. It's, probably the worst example of, what bad actors with nefarious intent can do when we misplace trust in them. So with that, I'm grateful for your valuable time and attention. I pray that we, the American people, can come to our senses about the tragic mistake we made in misplacing trust in the POTUS 47 regime and what they're trying to do and accomplish, and to take back our power and take back our nation, and to decide for ourselves that we want to be a nation of a more direct democracy, so we can create an ever more perfect union together that serves, to the best interest of all parties involved, so America works for everybody without the disadvantage of anybody, so nobody gets left behind. And that should be what we're aiming towards and what we're working towards. There's really no other way for us to protect and to defend the Constitution. And, kind of take that on as it's our duty just as much as it is anybody else in America to, preserve, protect, and defend our Constitution. and to know that our Constitution isn't just some piece of paper that's sitting behind a protective glass. It is a living story of our way of life. It's how we choose to show up every day. It's when we go out and we protest. It's when we, break news on stories of importance for the public to know and to be informed about. It's when we, point out the ridiculousness of the whole situation of, what people in positions of power think they're able to get away with, and pull the wool over our eyes, as they say. These are all important. And for us to be able to voice our opinions and for it to not be suppressed, for it to be heard in reasonableness on the merits. These are all very important things. And I think that once people have realized how close to losing it all that we are, they'll become more receptive to the idea of how to, claw back this power and put it back into the hands of the people, which is where the Constitution originally placed it. So with that, again, I'm grateful for your valuable time, attention, and consideration. Until next time, be well.